Well, welcome everybody to this session between some DA professionals and FMCA mediators in connection with child and domestic abuse. I'm Alexis Walker. I'm the chair of the Domestic and Child Abuse Panel on FMSB, as well as a mediator of, I realise now, over 30 years experience, which is rather frightening, really. I also have with me today Lorraine Bramble, who is also an FMCA mediator and a member of FMSB, and Adrienne Cox, who's also an FMC mediator and has done a lot of work in the domestic abuse field. And we also have with us today Sophie Francis Cansfield from Women's Aid, who is the head of policy. And the purpose of today's meeting is to promote a conversation between FMCA mediators and the domestic abuse field, when I hope we'll be able to share information and good practice with one another. Before we start, of course, mediation is a structured process. It doesn't just happen out of thin air. It happens in a very structured way. And I would like Adrienne to explain a little bit more to everybody what mediation is and what the process is and how it works. So Adrienne, over to you.
Thank you, Alexis. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending. Some of you might be mediators as well, so apologies. So you will probably know what I'm going to be talking about now. But for those of you who might not have that detail in terms of what mediation is and how it works and how it's structured, I'll just give you a little bit of a rundown. I think the first thing to emphasize is obviously mediation is voluntary, and I think that's a very relevant point in the light of what we're talking about. It is the first thing that I will always say to everyone that I speak to about mediation, in the sense that I will say mediation is a choice. It is something that people can choose to do or not. And it's also something that a mediator can say, actually, I don't think this is going to be suitable or safe to proceed. There is a difference between what we call the mediation, which is the mediation session, and the mediation information and assessment meeting, the MIAM. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that in a moment. So mediation, what is it? It's very much there as one of the ways in which people can sort out any issues that arise following separation or divorce. So it is just one way. It is an option. There are other ways in which people can also sort out issues that come up after separation, whether that's solicitor negotiation, collaborative law, arbitration, court system, etc. I'm going to be focusing just on the mediation. It's a confidential process. So when we're having discussions with people in mediation, we will emphasize with them that all the discussion that they have in mediation are protected. They're not legally binding on them as a result of anything that is said in mediation, because we always sort of suggest and hope, certainly in financial matters, that they might get legal advice alongside mediation too. So they always have that ability. But it enables people that want to mediate, that want to say, okay, this is the way we want to sort things out, to actually move forward, as opposed to, I suppose, getting stuck in what has happened in the past. So it's very much all about moving forward, and it's problem solving based. It is all about saying, this is what's happening, where are you both trying to get to, and how can I help you both do that? So very much solution focused. But the reality is it's not for everyone. And so what happens in every single mediation that we have is that we have to assess, as a mediator, we have to assess whether mediation is the right process for them. And they also have to decide whether it's something that they want to do. So it's a two-way assessment, if you like. So if I just tell you a little bit about how the assessments are structured and how they will carry out. We're all slightly different as mediators, but the reality is we also have Family Mediation Council standards and regulations that tell us what needs to be covered in a MIAM. I'm going to use that for the short, the Mediation Information Assessment Meeting. But I'm just going to tell you the way I would do it and how I how I approach it. So the first thing that I will do when I'm in an assessment meeting with somebody, and I'll call them my client for now. So when I'm with a client, I will say to them, okay, what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be telling you about mediation, what it is, so you can get a feel of it as much as you can, ask questions. But then it's really important that I hear from you as to where you're at, what's happening, what's going on, what you're thinking you might want to use mediation for potentially, and then we can think about next steps towards the end of the meeting. And I say my bit's the quick and easy bit. So most of the meeting actually is there for them to do the talking and for me to ask specific questions so I can get a feel of it, so I can hear what is happening for them. So I'm not going to give you my sort of spiel about what mediation is. I've done that a little bit in terms of explaining what mediation is. So the next step is that they will be telling me what is happening. Now, the whole way through that process, I'm going to be listening as a mediator to, do I think mediation is going to be safe? Do I think it's going to be helpful, suitable, and so on? So for the rest of that meeting, they are sharing their experience as to what's happened, where they're at, what they're thinking, what's going on. I will be asking questions to make sure that I get a feel as to whether there are any safety issues, domestic abuse concerns. And I will do that based on, I suppose, to a certain extent, my experiences, but actually the training that I've had. I also personally deliver training, I think as Lorraine does as well, in terms of domestic abuse, but in terms of that. But I'm looking out for an indication of the behaviors of domestic abuse. I'm listening to what they're saying. I'm listening to get a feel of it. And I will then follow those up. So a little bit like when you have your sort of Safe Lives checklist, in my mind is also those sort of questions. And I'll be asking a lot of those questions as well. And I'll be following those questions up because I need to really have a good understanding of what their lived experience is, as well as the impact on them of that. Because in my head, I'm thinking, if I'm going to be putting two people into mediation, is it safe? Can they negotiate on any kind of level playing field? And I don't actually always expect it to be like that, because actually it rarely is. It's that or that. But what I'm looking for is it that? Because if it is that, I'm likely to be saying at the end that actually I don't think mediation is going to be the right process. So those are all the things that I'm listening for. Obviously, everyone, Lorraine and Alexis might also sort of add something that I might have forgotten about. But when we are screening in the assessment meeting, we're not just screening for domestic abuse, in fact. We are screening for child protection concerns. We're screening for alcohol, drugs, mental health concerns, emotional readiness for mediation. So actually, there's a whole heap of things that we're actually looking for when we're sort of thinking, is this the right process? I think it is, I really want to emphasize the importance for all of us as mediators, how we need to understand the impact of domestic abuse on the person that we're seeing. And that is something that is hugely important because we recognize, we recognize that actually that's what's going to be important in deciding whether this is a safe process. So once we've had that conversation and we're thinking about, okay, next steps, we will be having a conversation with the participant, with the client, as to, okay, well, what I'm thinking is this. What do you think about that? And that actually is a conversation that's really important for us to have before we sort of go on to the next steps. Because if we're thinking, actually, no, mediation is not suitable, we need to share that with them and say, this is what we're thinking. It's not suitable. What do you think about that? Let's think about what your options are if we don't proceed with mediation. If I assess it as not suitable, what are the next steps for you? And I will explore those with the client or the participant. And I think the other thing to emphasize is that very often situations are very complex and very gray. Sometimes they're wonderfully clear, black and white, and that's those decisions about suitability are easy for us as mediators. But actually, there is a vast number of people that we see on a very regular basis where it isn't black and white, it's very complex. And you might be speaking to somebody and having that discussion, okay, well, what are our options here? And they will make it very clear, and we'll probably come back to this later on, but they will make it very clear that actually they are desperate to mediate, even though I, as a mediator, might be thinking, I don't think this is the right thing. And often, I mean, I even remember situations where I've said to a client at the end of that assessment meeting, I don't think mediation is safe. And they said to me, I wish I hadn't told you. And I would love to get some feedback in the Q&A, you know, maybe later for that. So these are very complex assessments, if you like, that we're making as to suitability. Is it the right process? Is it not? And for many people, what they say is that mediation is the best of the worst, because they also think, actually, well, if you say no to me, then you're pushing me down the court route. And we still might say no, even though that's the case, and we really might do that. But actually, we have to think about that when they're having that conversation with us and they say that to us. You know, we're thinking, okay, well, what do we do with that? How can we make it safe? And I think the last thing I want to say before I sort of pass it and well, watch the videos, is that it's really important when we talk to people about whether or not you might want to mediate, is that there are different models of mediation. So I will always talk to participants about the different types of different models of mediation. So the obvious one is in person, in a room, two people sitting in a room. Actually, since COVID, that is very much not the only option. In fact, more people are probably still doing online mediation, where people don't have to go into the same building. They don't have to draw up in the same car park. They can actually just be in their own, hopefully safe spaces. And then you've got the models of, if you're online like this, whether you have two people in the same meeting space, or actually very commonly, and probably in the vast majority of cases where there has been abuse, if it happens at all, then it's two people in separate spaces. So the participants don't see each other, they don't hear each other, and the mediator just goes backwards and forwards between them. And actually that gives a lot of people the feeling of, actually, that's okay like that, because we don't have to. I'm very conscious that even though it might be shuttling, I would say to people, it still could trigger you. Can we just talk that through and see how you feel about that? Because I think it's not just shuttle is safe, but for many people, that shuttle option, separate meeting spaces, is actually fine, and they feel actually empowered in that way. So there are various things that we can do, and there's hybrid mediation as well, which I'm not going to talk about now, but that's another often separate space type mediation. And there's lawyer involvement and support, and there's all sorts of other models we might come back to in the Q&A. But I just really wanted to emphasize that in terms of, it's very much those assessments first, and then mediation. When people say, I have to mediate, we all say, no, you don't have to mediate. Actually, you sometimes do have to attend a MIAM if you're thinking of going to court. So that is a stepping stone, but you definitely don't have to mediate. But I hope that gives there's a lot more I could say, but I don't want to talk any longer. And I hope that gives a little bit of a flavour of those initial steps in terms of moving into mediation and what mediation does.
Thank you, Adrienne. Lorraine, is there anything you want to add there?
No, I think it's probably helpful to see the videos actually, and then I'm happy to come back in on various, because there's a lot to be said there, but as Adrienne says,
I think all I would like to say is that whilst the main assessment takes place at the MIAM, throughout the mediation process, the mediator is constantly assessing for suitability and safety, and that the mediator may well call it at some point during the mediation, actually, this is not appropriate any longer, and mediation can stop. And of course, either of the participants can stop mediation at any time as well. But assessment for safety is an ongoing process. So we have two videos for you to look at. And Sophie from Women's Aid is going to explain a little bit first before we show those videos.
Thanks, Alexis. Good morning, everyone. Really pleased to be part of this discussion. Women's Aid has a experts by experience network. So experts by experience are the term that we use for survivors of domestic abuse that we engage with in our policy, public affairs, campaigns and research. So both of the women who've provided videos have gone through mediation. Unfortunately, in these two scenarios, they did not have the best experience of mediation, and that will be clear through kind of what they share. But as Adrienne said, there are things to explore within the Q&A and the discussion that we'll have post the videos. But yeah, we're very grateful to Laura and Vicky for sharing their experiences and thoughts with us.
Thank you. So these two videos are the views and perception of Laura and Vicky. And I think the mediation world would acknowledge mediation is not always perfect. And as Adrienne has already said, it isn't always for everyone. We're working hard on that to try and improve training, improve experiences, and improve the assessment process for anybody coming through the mediation process. Alicia, would you start with video 1, please? We may have a few moments just to get these set up.
Next, if there are difficulties, I could share.
Alicia, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can I just check? Because was that video not playing? Because
It was not playing.
Sorry, everyone. Bear with me 1 second.
Alicia, I wonder if you turn your camera on, whether that might help, just in terms of sharing of your screen.
You're on mute.
Bear with me 1 second.
Yes, that's
it.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Laura, and I want to share my experience of mediation. I left my son's father when the situation was extremely volatile and dangerous. He was keeping guns at our home and threatened to kill himself if I left. All of this was said in front of our 4-year-old son at the time. Women's Aid admitted me into refuge, and I began the process of navigating the systems to get a divorce from him. He asked for mediation to formalize child arrangements. Initially, we started off with 75% of the time our son was with me, as his work prevented him from having him any more time. When we went to mediation, he asked for more time, and I was asked to give him an extra night a week. I was unhappy with this, but was encouraged to do what was right for our son. Right for who? Emboldened that he could use the systems to get more time, he applied to court for 50-50 access, and then created a situation to accuse me of parental alienation, and was granted primary custody, where he now has 85% of the access and I have 15. I have grave concerns over what's happening whilst my son is in the care of his father, but I've been silenced by the court system, which seems impossible to change once an order has been made to a father. Mediation is not suitable for high conflict personalities, and I would hazard a guess that most of the mediation fall into this category. It's a tool for them to coerce the other party to doing what they want, and there must be safeguards to keep high conflict personalities in check, because they will use the system to steamroller protective parents. Perhaps it's too late for me and my son. I can only hope that the example of the life I lead is enough to inspire him to grow up to be different from his dad.
Thank you, Alicia. Can you show video 2, please?
My name is Vicky. My name is Vicky Kapoor. I'm just giving a brief 5-minute video on my views on family mediation and domestic abuse. I feel that the assessment of suitability, I don't think there's real understanding of domestic abuse and how it affects co-parenting and child contact. And I don't think that mediators are sufficiently trained to deal with domestic abuse and what to do if mediation isn't suitable for both parties. What if mediation isn't suitable? Then the only other choice is to go to court. And I don't think that, I think that mediation is seen as a stepping stone for abusers to basically do mediation, get the MIAMs, and then go to court. So I don't think that, I don't actually know what the alternative is. If there is one, then it should be made known for everybody to know what that alternative is. Mediation safe. I think then mediators need to be trained to spot where there's abuse, and if there is mediation and you can tell over the call, or just have more training for mediators to be aware of this. And benefits of mediation, the most reasonable people, they can resolve issues and they can both go away, negotiate, and come back with an agreement that they're both happy with. But to be honest with you, I think people that go to court are just abusers, and they know that they can just hold firm on what they want and get the MIAMs, or do mediation, get the MIAMs and go to court, and then get what they want when they go to court. So there really is no benefit, because if people are going to sort it out, then they'll sort it out beforehand. If they won't, then they'll just use mediation as a stepping stone to go to court to get what they want and to continue the cycle of abuse. That's all from me. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Alicia. So I think our thanks must go to both Laura and Vicky for being brave enough to share that with us. And I think it'd be fair to say that it certainly gave those of us on the panel a lot of food for thought. And that is what I think that we in the mediation world are trying to improve upon, and have been over the last couple of years, and will continue to do so. And we hope that this will allow us to share some better information about how we work and what we hope to achieve, and that we do treat domestic abuse very seriously as an issue to deal with in the mediation process. So Lorraine, maybe I could start with you.
Yes.
If we think about Laura first.
Yeah.
What are your initial thoughts and your initial assessment of suitability or not? And that's a tough one, because there's lots of information we do not know about this case. And perhaps it's about talking about those issues that we would want to explore to help us form an assessment of suitability or not.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I'd echo as well, Alexis, what you just said about, both Laura and Vicky, that it's actually very hard, I think, to go speak publicly about these things, particularly in this sort of environment where it's going to be sort of out there. So I think it's really good that they have felt able to do so. I mean, you asked me about Laura first. I mean, I found that one quite upsetting to listen to in many ways, because it was very clear from what Laura was saying that there were various things that most trained mediators would identify as red flags in terms of whether this case was suitable. I would have expected, if Laura had been to see me, that I would have been asking questions, whereas as Adrienne had already mentioned earlier, which would give Laura the opportunity to talk about some of these issues, but in particular the fact that the situation at home was clearly very unsafe. She talked about weapons. She talked about her ex threatening suicide. She clearly had to make use of the refuge and had support there. And the other issue that was, for me, very concerning was that a lot of what happened at home had been witnessed by her 4-year-old child as well, which in itself is very damaging to children and young people and is in itself a safeguarding issue. So as a mediator, as the individual meetings at the beginning, questions would always be asked, not only about what has happened and what has led to the end of the relationship, but quite specifically stuff around what it was like when things were home, when they were together, and were there any times that, you know, either of them felt unsafe or threatened? Had there been other agencies involved? Had anyone had to seek help from other agencies or the police or anything like that? So these are all very standard questions that every mediator would be asking in a MIAMS. And I would hope that a MIAMS would be handled in such a way as Laura would have felt safe to at least have said something about that. And as Adrienne was saying earlier on, that very often people will make a comment about the situation, which is not very specific, but, you know, may raise some concerns about what had happened. And most mediators are trained to pick up on those questions, those comments, and ask a little more about it and really get an understanding not only of what has happened, but what the effect has been on the person of that, and in particular, their ability to take part on an equal basis in a discussion with the other person. I think the other things that worried me a bit as well, because obviously this went on to mediation, were the point that she made that she was asked to give an extra night. Now, it is very common, obviously, in mediation when parties are talking together for one to be saying, well, I'd like this, and the other say, no, I would like that. And the mediator's job really is to help that conversation, to facilitate that conversation. But throughout that, there shouldn't be a point ever where a mediator is saying to either party, I would like you to, could you? And in terms of trying to be persuaded that that would be a good idea, as she suggested, you know, in the best interest of her child. What she was saying was that she was unhappy about the arrangements that were being made. She felt uncomfortable about them. And I think all mediators would be saying, if either of you feel uncomfortable about the arrangements that are being suggested, particularly if you don't think they're safe for your child or indeed for you, it's really important that you say so, and that you shouldn't be agreeing to things which is likely to put anyone in any danger or make anyone unsafe. So again, that's something that mediators would typically check out as to, you know, what their concerns might be and trying to understand more about that. And again, it can be very difficult for people to say that in the room together. Sometimes, particularly if one is you know, very nervous of the other, or there's been a history of intimidating behaviour that's really sort of undermined one person. So again, mediators would typically make it very clear, both the MIAMS meetings, but also at any joint meeting, whether it's online or in person, that if at any point either of them are feeling that they would like a break, or feeling uncomfortable about anything or the way the meeting's going, that they would it's okay to ask for a break, and they don't have to give a reason. The mediator themselves can ask for a break as well if they can see stuff going on which they're concerned about, or have concerns that one person is agreeing to things that they may not be comfortable with. So there should always be the opportunity for people to put separately, and maybe then feel more able to say, actually, no, I'm really worried about this, or I'm feeling, you know, pressured into this decision. So there are lots of things in what Laura described which were worrying. I mean, what was really sad to hear, and to some degree it was reflected, I think, in Vicky's comments as well, was that actually their experience then going on to court was certainly no better, and if anything worse. And again, this sense that, and I think this is something that people worry about sometimes when they come to mediation and say they would like to try mediation, even where from the mediator's point of view it looks unsuitable, is that the other options open to them seem even worse. And I think it is really important that as part of perhaps having to say to somebody, I don't think mediation is suitable either at the MIAM stage or indeed stopping mediation later on if it becomes clear it's unsuitable, is to not only talk through what those options might be, but also signpost them to organisations like Women's Aid and others that can offer support to them, and where they know they will be sort of heard and understood and their experience understood. So yeah, I mean, those were my initial feelings about it. And I think one of the key things as well that Laura said there was that mediation, she's concerned that mediation can be used as a tool for coercion. There is always a real risk of that, and that has been recognised, I think, for many years in mediation. And so it is really important that mediators are aware of that and do absolutely everything they can to check out whether that is a possibility in both at the MIAM stage, but keep an eye on it going forward as well, even if things look okay at the MIAM stage, because things can change. And I've certainly had experience of that as well, that things escalate once mediation starts between the parties. And that it should never be used as a platform for one person to just reinforce the power imbalance that has already been there. And as I said, there's a lot that mediators do, both that they learn in training, but then also implement in practice, which is constantly looking out for that and constantly rechecking that, and also making use of people like their professional practice consultant as a sounding board, someone they can go to and say, look, I've got some worries about this case, can I just talk it through with you? So that they're not just doing this in isolation, they are checking it out with more experienced mediators, sometimes in their practice consultant, but certainly to get a second opinion, and not be afraid to actually say, unfortunately, we can't proceed further, and actually do that in a safe way as well. So it doesn't put the responsibility on the parties themselves, but it's something, the responsibility that the mediator takes themselves. I don't know if that's helpful at all.
I think that's a very full assessment of your view of the situation. Can I ask you, Adrian, is there anything else that you would like to add? And can one of you perhaps be able to tell us what the benefits of using mediation might be?
I think, thank you. And Lorraine, yeah, I agree with everything that you've said. There's nothing I disagree with there. I did want to add, it's not clear from, I mean, it was very sad. It's sad to hear both of the negative experiences, because I've had so many positive experiences in my own mediation world in terms of dealing with this. But I think it was very sad to hear what Laura's saying is and Vicky, the experiences of both the mediation and the court system were really unhelpful and unsupportive and so on. So I think that is always very sad to hear, because it leaves such a large group of people so vulnerable in terms of where do they go for the right. But I just wanted to, I'm not clear from Laura's example whether she was in separate spaces or the mediator had them in the same space, same room. I just want, because when it's very easy, when Laura talked about, I think the mediator encouraged her to accept an extra day. Obviously, we weren't there, we don't know the detail of that conversation. But when you are shuttling as a mediator, it actually, I always say to my clients that actually you've just got to be aware this can challenge your perception of my impartiality, because the reality is when I'm with mum, I'm sharing what dad has been asking for and saying. When I'm with dad, I'm sharing what mum has been saying. And so I always warn them up front that just be aware of that, because I'm doing that backwards and forwards. So that is the risk of shuttle. I think in terms of the benefits of mediation, the benefits are there as long as it's safe and suitable. Lots of benefits, and for many people mediation is the best option, even when there has been some some abuse. Again, it depends where they are on that pathway. It depends where they are on that pathway to recovery and so on, and on the basis that it's got to still be safe and suitable. But for a lot of people, they will say the benefits are that actually they can't afford the legal advice, unfortunately, and they can't afford to go to court. And the idea of going to court fills absolute horror and dread. Now, in an ideal world, court, we would all be totally pleased with court and the court system and how and the family justice system and how they deal with things. But I don't think we're there yet. So for a lot of people, the fact that a mediator who does have that depth of knowledge and understanding about abuse and impact and so on can support them in a safe way as they can. If mediation isn't safe, it's not going to happen. It shouldn't happen. But as long as they can support someone gently, carefully through the process with constant assessing, then actually a lot of people say that is definitely the better way to do it. But I did want to address, before we move on to Vicky's, there was a question in the chat that someone talked about whether we take into account the abused person was likely to see the receiving a poor deal as normal. And just in answer to that, in mediation, there is no normal because every single family is different. So a very important question that I will ask people in the assessment meetings is, do they feel they can disagree safely? If you disagree with the other person, what are the likely consequences? What do you think might happen? Because I need to feel that someone can disagree safely. So they need to be able to share. If they don't agree with what's being put, they need to be able to share. So if somebody says to me, actually, I just tend to do what they say, I don't disagree ever, and if I did, this would happen, or I wouldn't possibly disagree, then I'll say mediation isn't the right thing, because you have to be able to disagree if it's going to be helpful. So I think I don't think in our lives there's any norm at all, because every single person we see has their own experience and story, and every family is different. So I think that's probably all I say at this point, because I want to come to Vicky's and so we have time for that, and I think address her thoughts about training. So
yeah. Before we get to Vicky's, can I just ask Sophie if she has any comments, observations in terms of what she's heard regarding mediation and its approach to dealing with Laura?
I think obviously it's really welcome to hear Lorraine and Adrienne's reflections, because that the kind of comfort that the knowledge that is coming with that curiosity, and both of them looking for the signs and kind of hearing the kind of a safer approach that would have been taken, which of course unfortunately wasn't Laura's experience. I think perhaps this is, well, potentially making a bit of an assumption, but perhaps some of the point the first question is getting to around, and I think, Lorraine, you commented on this in terms of the kind of connection with their survivors' wider experience through the kind of justice system. And I think it's just needing to take account of the wider situation and the wider barriers and challenges that an individual is kind of coming up against, regardless of kind of what's going on in that specific assessment meeting or conversation about mediation. So, those very unfortunate common experiences where survivors do fear the repercussions from their perpetrator if they disclose abuse, whether or not they're still together, how many years afterwards. We know how dangerous the kind of post-separation time is for survivors. What harm disclosing their abuse will do, either in the kind of the situation that finds them in that discussion or conversation, or because of previous negative experience that they've had. I know from another Experts by Experience in our network that she had gone through, I think, 7 different mediation kind of experiences. And of course, each one has a kind of an accumulative knock-on effect to how she responds and deals with that situation. But I think also, it's really important not to assume that the individual knows what they're experiencing. So, they might not realize or identify what they're experiencing to be domestic abuse. And I think the second question that's in the Q&A around the kind of some of the particular barriers around language and kind of the different experiences dependent on an individual's background, unfortunately, across society, myths and stereotypes about who experiences domestic abuse, in what relationships, how, etc., is unfortunately still very common and prevalent in our society. So, there are still an ongoing kind of learning and improvement that we can make around that, and that wider context that I say that I think is just really helpful for mediators to kind of to think about, aside from what is being said, either said or not said to them in the room, and why that might be.
Thank you, Sophie. So Vicky, Adrienne, would you like to start with your thoughts and observations and suitability or not questions, etc., with Vicky?
So thanks, Alexis. I think with Vicky, obviously, I can't really comment on suitability because she didn't share any of her experience as such. She was very much sharing her opinion after her experience, so her thoughts after the experience. So I can't really comment on suitability, unfortunately. But in terms of her experience, it clearly made her feel that whatever her experience was, that mediators do not have enough training in domestic abuse. And in terms of their understanding of the impact of domestic abuse. Or in fact, I think she referred to the understanding of what happens next steps, if it's unsuitable. I think, as we said, similarly to Laura, her experience of the court is equally or even more poor and damaging. And the fact that the perpetrator will use mediation potentially as to say, yeah, tick box, I've done that, tried that, wasn't I good? And now I'm going to go to court. And what she was referring to is the ability of the perpetrator to use both processes as a way to continue the abuse. That is something, unfortunately, mediation doesn't have a magic wand. Mediation can't change the perpetrator. And I would say no matter how many ground rules you might want to put in place for communication, mediation cannot change the perpetrator. The only thing that can change a perpetrator's behavior, if anything, is going to be them dealing with that themselves. They have to do that. So, I think what is really important is that mediators do have that depth of understanding. And I think that is something that we as mediators totally agree with. In fact, domestic abuse training on terms of screening and assessment is part of the Mediation Foundation course, and perhaps much more now than it used to be. It is also part of the portfolio accreditation process. So when mediators do their training and they then apply to be an accredited mediator, they have to prove certain things about their understanding of domestic abuse. It is also part of their, every 3 years, mediators have to reaccredit, and they have to do certain training in between those 3 years. And as part of that, they have to do domestic abuse training. I think there is, however, even more we can do. I think we must never stop learning. And I think no matter how often I train on this, every single time I do, I learn more and more and more. So it is something that we can never have enough knowledge and understanding. We have to keep learning. And I think it's really important for all mediators to take that on board and to ensure that they do. I say it is a requirement, but that's always, requirements are one thing. Obviously, it's important for all mediators to actually do that and get as much training as possible. I think it's also really important, following on what Vicky said about that understanding, it's really important that mediators do work with those in the domestic abuse sector. So we can really learn from them, and they can learn from us in terms of what we do and how we work, but we can learn from each other to ensure that mediation is as safe as it possibly can be if it does go ahead. And there is the Mediation and Domestic Abuse Network that I'm involved with that has been having this conversation for several years now, which is absolutely fantastic. In an ideal world, mediators would also know their local DA. So specialists in the area. They'd know the local IDVAs. They'd be able to really understand if mediation doesn't happen, what are the signposting? What are the next steps? So, if Vicky had been with me and if I'd assessed it as not suitable, I'd be saying to her, well, actually, there's a fantastic charity called More Positive Me. They do this. There's another charity that does that. There's another organization that does this. And I would know that because I have the links already with these people in my area. So I think we can always improve. And I think it's really important to listen to Vicky and her experience was, and why she was led to believe that. I think there's always room for improvement.
Thank you. Lorraine?
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on Adrian's last point there, I mean, I think as well, it's really helpful to be able to say to people, to give people that reassurance that there are people and organisations out there who will take them seriously, who will understand what they're talking about, and are there to help them. So having those contacts and knowledge, I think, is really important. And I think the other thing that I emphasise there as well is that whilst mediators have to be impartial in the way they are conducting mediation, if you're in a situation where you're presented with somebody who is unsafe or living in an unsafe situation or is in need of help and support, and first of all, mediation is probably not going to be suitable, in which case your impartiality is not an issue, because this is not people's safety takes priority over everything else. And so it is fine at that point if someone has said to you in a MIAMS, I need this is happening, and you're talking about the support they might need, that it takes priority over everything else. And so giving people the support to do that is something that's very much part of a mediator's role, I would say, in those circumstances. I mean, I think the other thing that struck me when I was watching Vicky's video is that in many ways, she raises in her short video the key questions, or some of the key questions that have driven the development of standards and training in family mediation over a number of years, in fact. In particular, the whole thing around understanding what the effect of domestic abuse actually has on people, on co-parenting arrangements, on child contact arrangements. And I would want to offer reassurance that, those things are covered on basic foundation training for family mediators, that it's not just, talking a bit about it in a sort of academic way. It's actually understanding the impact that these domestic abuse can have on these things and people's ability to negotiate, but also understanding that that can be different for different people at different times. And so one of the things that we encourage people to look at is not just what has happened, but what has the impact of that been on them. And what's very interesting is that the same sort of events can have a very different impact on people's ability to take part in discussions on an equal basis. And so you can't make any assumptions about that. It's not just about what's happened, it's about how has that affected you? How will that affect your ability to talk with somebody, with the other person? So again, that is a key part of training. We've talked already about what happens if things aren't suitable and the need for proper signposting and support in that as well. And I think that what I felt really sad about in a way was that with both of their experiences, it had been such a negative experience, and it had really reinforced their sense of, powerlessness in this, that actually the perpetrator of their abuse would just be able to use whatever systems were made available to them to get their own way. I would want to say that certainly in terms of the way mediators are trained, in terms of the way that we've developed our standards and continue to, mediators are and should be working very hard to ensure that that isn't the case in mediation. We haven't got control over other systems like the courts and that, but in mediation, that is a top priority for mediators, is to ensure that the mediation is being used in a way which is safe and fair, and that we should work with both parties, in fact, to work out what is the best way of doing that, and put those systems in place to make sure that people can take part on an equal basis. And if we can't do that, then we shouldn't be mediating it.
Thank you. Sophie.
I'll keep my comments brief because I think it'd be worthwhile making sure there's time to come back on Sheena's question. But I suppose just to kind of echo the comments from Adrienne and Lorraine about the importance of signposting, and I think just in response to question 3, making sure that you're kind of aware of the full breadth of services that are out there, regardless of whether your client or participant is a man or a woman or someone from the LGBT plus community or deaf or disabled. There are, of course, support services for all people. So it's really important to be aware of all. And we, Women's Aid, work quite closely with Respect, who support male survivors. And we've particularly worked with them previously on mediation when this was something the last government were looking at. So there are an array of directories out there that include all services, including Women's Aids. So yeah, I just wanted to reinforce that point, but want to ensure we can get to Sheena's question.
Okay. And I think certainly I've experienced men who have experienced domestic abuse, so we are very aware that it affects, not perhaps equally, but it certainly affects both male and female partners. There's a question here about power imbalances are often worse when English isn't one of the parents' first language. So how much does mediation training take this into account, as well as culture, context and implications for service users? Do either of you two want to comment on that? Lorraine? Adrienne?
Well, I think that is absolutely, we have to be aware of that. And I think it is, there is some training on cultural differences and impact on the mediation setting. I think there probably could be more training on that. I think it is something that we all do need to be aware of. I'm not going to say we are aware of it. I think many of us are aware of that and the importance of it, and recognizing the cultural impact on any family situation. But yeah, there could always be more training. What I did want to, just in terms of the question there that's focusing on women facing DA, everything we've said about safety applies to both men and women.
Yeah.
This is it's not gender specific, but it applies equally. And then I was going to, just because I know we're going to run out of time, Sheena's question about what more can be done to make it as safe as possible if mediation is going ahead beyond shuttle. I think shuttle obviously can be, I only do shuttle online now. So if I have concerns about any past abusive behavior or whatever, and I've decided together with the person that it's going to, we'll give it a try and see what happens, it will always be shuttle in my mind. It won't be on the same screen. But if people are doing in-person shuttle mediations, then what mediators do is make sure that they have arrangements in place where people won't bump into each other in the car park. So they will set it all up so that people don't see each other. That is, I think, really essential. And they will also have the same sort of a plan in place, but when they leave the mediation as well, to make sure that people can leave first, give them time to exit, and then the other person leaves.
Can I get to come in that as well, Adrienne? Because I mean, I do offer shuttle both online and in person. The main reason for it in person is I've had a number of cases where, quite often due to some kind of a disability or a neurodiversity or something like that, actually talking over a screen is difficult for them and they don't feel that they can fully take part. I've also found it, linking back to the other question about language, that where English isn't the person's first language, but nonetheless they feel able to take part in mediation, sometimes they find it easier talking again in person rather than over a screen. As you know, I think with all of these things, you need to check with the parties themselves what's going to work best for them, but absolutely echo your description as well of, if it is going to be shuttle and in person, considerable effort needs to be gone to make sure that people are safe in those spaces, so that they aren't able to, I mean, where we are, we have 2 rooms, the other party doesn't know where the other room is, and we have more than one exit. We would have separate arrival and leaving. We would normally ensure that the person who is at risk is able to leave first, and put as much in place as possible to make it as safe as possible. And yeah, so I think that's, again, these things can be done, but care needs to be taken. And if you're that worried about the safety, then again, it's probably one of those ones where it might be, we're having to say, even where people are asking for it, if you as the mediator can't be reassured that it's going to be safe, you know, to have to say that I'm really sorry, I actually don't think that this is going to be suitable, you know, at the moment. And I always put in at the moment, because things change sometimes. So it's not a no forever, but sometimes it just isn't the right time.
Sophie, have you any thoughts about, perhaps, is there any other way you can see mediators working with potential clients if our shuttle session is not suitable? Have you any thoughts?
I think Adrian's earlier comment about kind of not only kind of knowing who your local services are, but kind of, you know, establishing kind of actual kind of working relationships with them, because, you know, these are services that have been embedded in their local communities for decades, and, you know, their understanding of not only kind of domestic abuse, but, you know, the impacts for the survivors in their kind of community is just so incredibly valuable. But I think, you know, wider, we also we need to see the improvements elsewhere in the justice system, because that is unfortunately, you know, what is happening elsewhere isn't happening in isolation. It of course is directly connected to what we're talking about today in terms of mediation. So, you know, we do also need to ensure that we're continuing to strive to make the wider justice system work for all survivors. And when I say that, I'm including children and adults within that.
I think we would all agree with that. And can I just say one last thing to do with the questions about English isn't the parent's first language? Of course, interpreters can be used in mediation. I don't think there is any specific training. I think that's something perhaps we should be looking at for the profession, but we can use interpreters to help with the language barrier. So I think we've come to the end, bang on time, which is wonderful. I'd like to thank everyone on the panel for taking part, and Alicia for helping us out. As mediators, I'd like to thank both Vicky and Laura. I think it's been very valuable to hear their experiences, and it's been very brave of them to share it with us. I hope those involved in the domestic abuse feel better informed and reassured about how mediators approach domestic abuse in general. Lorraine, myself and Adrienne have been doing this a long time, and our aim is to try and bring as many people as possible up to a really high standard for managing domestic abuse and giving people the best possible service if they're thinking of using mediation, and keeping them safe, because that is the priority throughout it all. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Very much.